Now a certain man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel in a joint of the armor. This is not marksmanship here we're talking about. This is a stray arrow fulfilling whose prophecy? So he said to the driver of his chariot, "Turn round and take me out of the fight, for I am severely wounded." And the battle raged that day, and the king was propped up in the chariot in front of the Arameans and died at evening. And the blood from the wound ran into the bottom of the chariot.
So does God rule over every action of man? Or are there some actions that escape God's providential authority? In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper turns to 1 Kings 22 to show God's absolute rule even over what seems random to us. This seminar was originally given at Bethlehem Baptist Church on October 11th, 1995.
Job 37. Elihu talking. Remember I told you last week that Elihu's a good guy in Job, I believe. He's not rebuked like Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar in the last chapter. Here's what he has to say about the weather, or the natural world. "For to the snow, God says, fall on the earth, and to the downpour and the rain, be strong. He seals the hand of every man, that all men may know his work." Let's stop there, man. That's the one I circled last week. Said, can't unpack that in 2 minutes. What does that mean? In this context, the beast goes to its lair and remains in its den. Out of the south comes the storm, and out of the north the cold. From the breath of God ice is made, and the expanse of the waters is frozen. Also with moisture he loads the thick clouds. He disperses the cloud of his lightning, and it changes direction, turning around by his guidance. Wow, there's some great stories from the history of war as to how battles were won by shifting winds. That it may do whatever he commands it on the face of the inhabited earth, whether for correction. This is interesting commentary now. There's a little theodicy here. Theodicy means the justifying of the ways of God to men. Whether for correction or for his world or his earth, or for kindness or mercy, he causes it to happen. So there's three possible answers to the why question of why it blows the way it blows, and it rains the way it rains, and it snows the way it snows. But let's go back up here. In this context, he seals the hand of every man, that all men may know his work. In this context, what does sealing the hand of man mean? The context, to me, seems to indicate that if God controls snow and rain and wind, then the working hands of man that are his means of making a living and producing and getting are really very dependent on, he's a farmer, and this was an agrarian society. His hands are just going to go shoo if God holds rain back. There's two ways you can keep something out of a hand. One is take it away, and the other is lock up the hand. You can try to grab it and you can't do it, or you grab for it and it gets taken away. And I think that the sealing up of the hand here is simply the providence of God over man's productivity, so that he, if he has eyes to see, will say, God's doing it. I'm not God. I'm not God. As long as we think that our hands have control or can take into themselves everything they need and rule for us, we won't acknowledge God. as the sovereign over the world. But if our hands are suddenly sealed, then we really have to come to terms with whether we are utterly dependent or not. That's the best I can do anyway with this verse. Anybody got another comment on it? Or insight into verse 7? The reason it's so interesting is because it shows that in all of this talk about weather and in all of God's providential activity in the weather, the issue is coming to know God, coming to know Him. Snow is meant to help you know God. Rain is meant to help you know God. Minnesota winters with blue, painful fingers are meant to help you know God. The heavens are telling the glory of God. Winter heavens, summer heavens, dark heavens, and everything under the heavens are meant to declare the glory of God. God is very eager for us to awaken. These flowers here are meant, just look at that. Just look at those flowers. Who thought up such amazing things? Another word or two about these last purpose clauses here. Why does God do this? Why does He guide the lightning and the moisture and the clouds and the ice? And He says for correction. So there's a rebuking, correcting thing going on. For His land or His world. And for kindness. Isn't that interesting? I think, not sure what the difference between all these are. These three. What the difference in them is. I wrote Cooper here in the margin because of a story that Helen Glegg passed on to me from her devotional reading, I suppose. From a little book called Streams in the Valley. The poet, William Cooper, was subject to fits of depression. One day he ordered a cab and told the driver to take him to London Bridge. Soon a dense fog settled down upon the city. The cabbie wandered about for 2 hours. He thought he could find the way home. He admitted he was lost, and Cooper finally asked him if he thought he could find the way home. The cabbie thought that he could, and in another hour landed him at his door. When Cooper asked what the fare would be, the driver felt that he should not take anything since he had not gotten his fare to his destination, and Cooper insisted, saying, "Never mind that, you have saved my life. I was on my way to throw myself off the London Bridge." He then went into the house and wrote, "God moves in a mysterious way His wonders to perform. He plants His footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm." Now maybe that's an illustration of loving kindness. And it works the other way. The Titanic had another experience with fog, right? But at least you can say this: the biblical writers believe there is purpose in it all. That's the least you can say. Whether we understand how God is correcting, who could say what the millions of ripple effects in 1,500 families from the perishing of the, 1,000 people on the Titanic? Who can say? Who can say what that did in world history? What kinds of correctings and loving kindness and blessings were coming? Who can say? Who can say? But there's no doubt where the fog comes from. Now this is God talking, not Elihu. And He's rebuking Job and querying him. And keep in mind, as I read it, that these are the kinds of questions that God asked Job that shut his mouth and caused him to despise himself and repent in dust and ashes and say, "Who can thwart your will?" in chapter 42. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, Job? Tell me. Or have you seen the storehouses of the hail? In other words, You don't have anything to do with where this comes from. You don't have a clue with how I do this. You've never been my counselor. You are not in charge here. Which I have reserved for the time of distress, for the day of war and battle. Now let's stop there for a minute. Let me read you Joshua chapter 10. Just to give you a living illustration of what that verse just said. Joshua 10:11. It's Joshua fighting the Gibeonites as he's attempting to take over the promised land. And this is what it says. The Lord threw them into a panic before Israel, who slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon and chased them by the way of the ascent of Beth-horon and smote them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And as they fled before Israel, while they were going down the ascent of Beth-horon, the Lord threw down great stones from heaven upon them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the men of Israel killed with the sword. I have reserved the hail for the time of distress and for the day of war and battle. Joshua 10:11. Now, I think I used as an illustration last year, sometime, the movie Henry V. How many saw Henry V? Henry V is a Shakespearean historical drama, and it tells the story of King Harry, the English king, going over to France and fighting the French, and he was vastly outnumbered on this one particular battle. I think, the numbers were just incredibly imbalanced. And one of the scenes has Harry kneeling down and beseeching God that his providence would have mercy upon them. And the next day, the battle engages, and it's a bloody scene. And as it ends, the British are triumphant. And if I remember correctly, the numbers were something like 25,000 French dead and a couple of dozen English dead. And Harry, King Harry, makes his soldiers swear that they will not boast in this victory because it is so manifestly a work of providence, and a man will be shot with bow and arrow if he boasts. And the two scenes at the end of it just so gripped me. One was the scene of him meeting with his soldiers, hearing the numbers, and saying, God has wrought a great victory for Britain today. And the other was the song that the soldiers began to sing. This was the most powerful moment in the movie for me, as they began to walk across the fields, just strewn with bodies and blood. They began to sing, Non nobis Domine, non nobis sed tua nomine gloria. It's Psalm 115:5. This is a secular movie. Non nobis nomine gloria. Remember that? See? Power. Which means, not to us, O Lord. Not to us. Non nobis. Not to us. But to your name give glory. Now, the theological significance for providence of this is a scene earlier during the battle. Here you've got these utterly outnumbered soldiers, and the way they set themselves up is that the bowmen are on their knees like this, with their bows way behind the lines, as the horses are smashing into others like this, and those horrible battles that existed before there were nice clean bullets to shoot, just hacking each other to pieces in those early wars. And the bowmen could not see. They just knew there were enemies out there. And so the leader would say, I don't know what he said, but aim, pull, fire. And what you saw on the movie was it looked like 5,000 arrows, like rain, just going and landing at random on the enemy. And 25,000 died. Who decides where arrows land? Who decides? King Harry knew who decided, and he would not let any man boast of this victory. The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord. That's Proverbs 21:31. I've got a biblical story like that. This is a story of the prophet Micaiah. Poor Micaiah. Boy, to be a prophet of God in the Old Testament was a thankless task, I'll tell you. Reading Jeremiah, get yourself thrown in the mud. And this poor fellow, I don't know how long he stayed in prison. He may have rotted the rest of his life in prison. So here's an example of random arrow doing God's bidding. Micaiah and the king of Judah are going to go up and do battle. And the king of Israel wants to hear some prophetic words about this. And so get all the prophets together, and all the prophets say, go up, you're going to have the victory. And I said, fine. And then the king says, isn't there any other prophets here? And the king, I forget which one, says, well, yeah, there's Micaiah, but he always prophesies evil against me. And so they call Micaiah. And Micaiah comes and says, go up. And the king says, I know you're not telling the truth. Tell us what you really think. And he says, if you go up, you're going to die. The king of Israel said, take Micaiah and return him to Ammon, the governor of the city, and to Joash the king's son, and say, thus says the king, put this man in prison and feed him sparingly with bread and water until I return safely. And Micaiah said, if you return safely, the Lord has not spoken by me. That's the last we hear of this poor fellow. There he goes to jail. It's like those poor guys who took an oath and say, we're not going to eat until we kill Paul. That's the last you hear of them. Well, they deserve to starve to death, but poor Micaiah, he didn't deserve to die in prison, and I don't know whether he did. But here's what happens at the battle. Now, a certain man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel in a joint of the armor. This is not marksmanship here we're talking about. This is a stray arrow fulfilling whose prophecy? So he said to the driver of his chariot, turn round and take me out of the fight, for I am severely wounded. And the battle raged that day, and the king was propped up in the chariot in front of the Arameans and died at evening. And the blood from the wound ran into the bottom of the chariot. Now that's another little story in itself, which I won't. The blood in the bottom of this chariot. He's dead. One prophecy is fulfilled. You're not coming back here alive. Kill me or not. And how does God fulfill that prophecy? This soldier from who knows where launches this arrow, and God says, there's the spot. He's dead. And God rules the flight of every arrow, including the 4x4s that killed my mother on December 16th, 1974, flying off the top of a VW van. I've never doubted that. I cannot worship a God who does not control the flight of 4x4s, who can't cause a blowout 10 minutes earlier. And there's just 100 ways he could have stopped it. So when I wept and wept and wept and wept, I never said, God, where were you? I said, save my daddy, because he was lacerated to pieces. And I said, thank you for letting me have her for 28 years. The rest of this story is that the blood in the bottom of this chariot goes back and they wash it down in the streets and the dogs lick it, and the comment is, and thus was fulfilled the word of the Lord that was made way before that the dogs would lick the blood of this king. God said, I'm going to get this king in the battle way up there, but I've got another prophecy that his blood is going to be eaten in the streets of this city. So he will bleed in the chariot. They won't leave the chariot out there. They'll bring the chariot back to the city and wash it where I tell them to wash it. And now you're getting close to human will being controlled, which there's no way to understand the fulfillment of prophecy without it.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper continues our 15-part series on God's providence with a talk titled, God's Providence Over Desires. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.